This is the brand new Raspberry Pi 400, and I think the best thing to do with it is to turn it into a 30-year-old computer. I'm Matt D'Amico, and welcome to episode 26 of Retro Bits. Before we get to retroifying this brand new computer, let's unbox it and take a quick look at what comes in the kit, as well as the specs of the Pi 400. And here it is, the brand new Raspberry Pi 400 personal computer kit. Let's take a look at what we've got here. Meet the Raspberry Pi 400, your complete personal computer. This kit contains everything you need to get started. Raspberry Pi 400 computer, USB mouse, power supply, SD card, HDMI cable, and beginner's guide. Everything except a TV or monitor. All right, well, let's open it up and see what is inside. All right, computer is right here at the top. Let's take a look at that first. Here we are. Very slim form factor. Very thin in the front and a little bit wider on the back, but not much. We've got the GPIO port. We've got a SD card slot pre-populated with a 16 gigabyte SanDisk SD card, micro SD card, 2 HDMI outputs, a USB-C power connector, 2 USB 3 and 1 USB 2 ports, the gigabit Ethernet, and what appears to be a key lock. All right, setting this aside, let's see what else is in the box. All right, we have power brick, an official Raspberry Pi mouse, and some literature. Let's take a look at that. Oh, here's the micro HDMI cable. We've got a adapter for regular SD card slots. And a pretty thick book. The official Raspberry Pi beginner's guide, how to use your new computer. All right, well, we'll have to take a look at this, but at first glance, it looks very colorful. It looks like there's a lot of examples here. I see some code. Very interesting. We'll have to take a closer look at what this is all about later. All right, let's take a look at the mouse. The official Raspberry Pi, that's not a mouse. Let's take a look at the mouse. The official Raspberry Pi mouse. That's a lot smaller than I thought. All right, it's pretty much a full-size mouse, same color as the computer. Oop. Oop. Yeah. Not bad. All right, there it is. At the time of filming, the complete Pi 400 kit retails for $100 US. Alternatively, you can opt to purchase the system by itself for $70, but it doesn't include the power supply, micro HDMI cable, mouse, or SD card. Weighing in at just 13.5 ounces, or 384 grams, this machine is a featherweight. The 400 harkens back to the era of the wedge-shaped computer and keyboard designs, but with a distinctively modern flair. As you can see, it's also much smaller than the machines from that period. As we'll later be looking at how it performs as a modern-day Amiga, it seems only fitting to compare it to one, but I don't have my 500 here, nor do I own a 1200, so the Atari ST is standing in, as size-wise it's in the same ballpark. Okay, time to take a peek inside. The top and bottom halves are secured together with plastic snaps. Once again, the car stereo installation tools make an appearance, as they shouldn't damage the plastic. The only connector we have to worry about is the keyboard ribbon cable that pops right out. Be careful when reassembling though. The plastic connector and pins inside it are very fragile. Once inside, there are only 4 screws that hold the heatsink in place, along with a conductive grounding pad that spans the gap between the heatsink and the USB port. An adhesive thermal pad joins the heatsink to the ARM CPU, and applying just a little pressure will unstick it. The heatsink itself is seriously beefy and probably contributes significantly to the system's overall weight. Inside, the new 400 is essentially a Pi 4B in a revised form factor. It features the same 64-bit quad-core ARM Cortex-A72 processor, now running at 1.8 GHz, a bump up from the 1.5 GHz of the 4B. The increased speed is due to the enormous heatsink, as well as a slightly revised version of the Broadcom source CPU. Other notable features are 4 GB of DDR4 3200 RAM, hardware H.265 decoding of 4K video at 60 frames per second, OpenGL support, built-in dual-band Wi-Fi, and Bluetooth. A nice feature I didn't notice at first is that Function F10 acts as a soft power switch that turns on or gracefully shuts down the Pi. This is a thoughtful inclusion, as previous models required less elegant solutions for power management. The supplied microSD card comes pre-installed with Raspberry Pi OS, the Linux desktop formerly known as Raspbian. The first time you boot it up, it will prompt you to configure a number of initial setup options, including the root password and Wi-Fi settings. Setup complete, let's take a quick look at the underlying OS. No surprises here, the 4 CPU cores are accounted for, and the bulk of the SD card is provisioned as a single root file system. There are quite a few pre-installed software packages, including development tools, the Chromium browser, LibreOffice, and VLC Media Player. There's even a Raspberry Pi version of Minecraft, and I couldn't resist clicking on that. I took a quick tour of a freshly generated world, and it runs great in this small window. I tried to get it to switch to full screen, but it doesn't appear possible in this version. Draw distance is a bit limited, as is the level of detail, but chunk loading times are fine. Also, the edition only has creative mode, not survival. That's fine though, it's not really intended to be played as a game, but more as a platform to learn programming using the Minecraft Python API. Okay, last thing before we get to the retro. Let's check the browser and video performance with what else but YouTube. I think I know just the channel. As you can already tell, rendering performance isn't the fastest, but it's getting the job done. Once it gets going, video playback is fine, though I'm not sure it's using the hardware acceleration here, judging from CPU utilization and load averages. Also, switching back and forth between full screen is a bit janky. But let's be realistic here, this is a low-priced ARM system on a chip. It's not really fair to compare it to a full-fledged desktop PC, and clock speed is only part of the equation. The system architecture plays a huge role in performance. Okay, retro time. Let's see how this modern interpretation of the all-in-one wedge computer handles emulating some classic systems. Fair warning, I was going to demonstrate running bare metal emulators on the Pi 400, and there are a number to choose from. I started with BMC64, a Commodore 64 emulator, but the latest build isn't compatible with the Pi 4 yet. I then looked at Combian, another 64 emulator, and Ambien, an Amiga emulator. While both have Pi 3 versions publicly available, neither have released Pi 4 versions yet. They both appear to have working private builds, but gaining access to the software requires a donation and an indeterminate wait time, something that isn't compatible with a just-in-time video production schedule. In the end, I decided to go with RetroPie, which should just work. It's a heavyweight multi-emulator solution that runs on top of Linux, but it works with the Pi 4, is mature, simple to install, and well supported. It also benefits from an easy-to-use graphical front end called Emulation Station and a wide array of emulation options to choose from underpinned by RetroArch and libretro. I should note that this review is not an exhaustive look at RetroPie, as that would be a whole episode in and of itself. Instead, we'll focus on the Amiga emulation with a few other systems thrown in for good measure. The first step is to download the latest RetroPie image and write it to the Pi's SD card. As usual, I'm using Win32 Disk Imager for this step, but you can use any tool you'd like on any platform. That done, we can insert the SD card into the Pi 400 and boot it up. After Linux starts and we see the RetroPie splash screen, Emulation Station starts automatically. Next, we need to drop to a shell with F4 and run the Raspberry config tool in order to set up Wi-Fi, locale, and critically, resize the default file system to use the entire SD card's free space. This will require a reboot and then we should be ready to rock. Once we've rebooted and gone through the initial controller configuration, we'll enter the RetroPie setup tool and install our Amiga emulator. It's not included as part of the default installation, but installing it, along with many other packages such as DOSBox, is a snap. Simply navigate to the package management section and install the precompiled binaries. AmiBerry is essentially a full-featured version of UAE, optimized for ARM-based systems. On this platform, it gives us the ability to emulate everything up to an Amiga 4000 with a fast 040 processor, gobs of memory, retargetable graphics, and much more. Once the installation is complete, we can return to Emulation Station and see our shiny new Amiga waiting to go for a spin. All we need now is some software. As we're going to emulate an Amiga, we need Kickstart ROMs and a hard disk image. As I demonstrated in the recent Mr. video, you can use Amiga Forever to export the ROMs and Amiga OS install media. Today, I'm going to reuse both the Amiga 1200 ROM and the virtual hard drive image I made for that video, as they should work right out of the box with AmiBerry. This is at least the third time I've used Amiga Forever ROMs for various emulation projects, so I've definitely got my money's worth out of it. Now, if you haven't used RetroPie before, it's got a neat party piece. Start with a FAT32 formatted USB thumb drive. It doesn't have to be blank, you can use one you've already got stuff on. Next, create a directory called RetroPie on it. Plug the drive into your RetroPie and it will automatically populate the directory with BIOS and ROM folders for each supported system. Now, we'll copy our Kickstart ROM, hard drive image, and some other software into these newly created directories. Plug the USB drive back into the Pi and it will automatically sync any new files over to the SD card into their correct locations for you. Easy peasy. You can also FTP them over if you prefer. With our files in place, we can now fire up the Amiga emulator for the first time. A slick feature of AmiBerry that I haven't seen anywhere else is the ability to launch not only floppy images, but also WHD load archives without the need to install them first. In this example, I've dropped a compressed LHA file onto my thumb drive and can launch it directly from Emulation Station, and it just works. How cool is that? Alternative to launching a program directly, you can start up AmiBerry from the menu, and it will take you to this familiar UAE configuration screen. All the usual suspects are here, along with a few predefined configurations to get you started. Immediately, I ran into a problem though. The mouse cursor wouldn't activate any of the dialogues. Its targeting was off, either too high or too low, and I couldn't click anything accurately. It took a bit of fiddling around, but in the end I found that by editing the Linux boot config.txt file and disabling overscan, everything worked fine after a reboot. Now armed with a functional interface, let's configure a maxed out Amiga 1200. A 68040 processor running at the fastest possible speed, 8 megabytes of chip, and 128 megabytes of fast RAM ought to be a good starting point. The hard disk image that I borrowed straight from the Mister and dropped on the USB stick got automatically copied over to the SD card, so let's add that too. And just like that, we've got a fully configured 3.1 system up and running. So you probably want to see how this thing performs, right? For that I'll install sysinfo, and what better opportunity to set up a shared folder on the Pi's file system. Of course, UAE lets us do this easily, and this folder will show up as a regular hard disk partition in our workbench. Just like with other directories, anything you toss here on your thumb drive gets automatically copied over. Then we can just install it to our main virtual hard disk like any other piece of software. Yeah, that'll do just fine. Okay, but not everything is kittens and rainbows with our new Amiga. Check this out. So I've spent hours trying to figure out what was causing this issue. In the end, it just came down to running the emulated 1200 at its original clock speed. I even tried UAE on my PC with the exact same settings, but was unable to reproduce the problem. After a bunch of testing, it turns out that most titles work completely fine at high clock speeds on the Pi, but not all of them. Perhaps some teething issues with the new platform. Of course, our high-end Amiga has RTG graphics. Oh, that's redundant, isn't it? But anyway, with display modes up to 1080p and 32-bit color with 128 megabytes of video RAM. And yes, before anyone asks, this Amiga setup is powerful enough to not just play Doom, but play it exceptionally well, including the full MIDI soundtrack. Of course, UAE can emulate any 68K Amiga, including the CD32. Just drop an ISO or bin.q file on your thumb drive and use the pre-configured settings in AmiBerry.
Dear Simon, I am pleased to announce that you have been chosen from literally hundreds of hopeful candidates to perform a death-defying but extremely worthwhile quest for which you will be rewarded quite a lot. All you have to do is rescue me from the hands of the evil sorcerer Sordid. Feel free to use my extremely valuable spellbook and dog to assist you. Look forward to seeing you soon. Wish you were here. Love and kisses.
I did notice some desync between the character and the digital sound, but it was the same on my PC as well, so it's possible it's just the game or endemic to UAE itself. While I was messing around with AmiBerry, I wondered if it would be possible to create a menu item in Emulation Station to start my 1200 directly. After some fiddling, it turns out that yes, it is possible by creating a shell script with the appropriate naming convention. Pay attention to the double quotes, they're necessary for things to work properly. After I got that working, I wanted to take it one step further and see if I could get the Pi to cold boot straight into the Amiga 1200. Turns out that's not hard to do either. Remember when I talked about those bare metal emulators? If you're intent on turning your Pi into a single type of retro system, those will give you much faster startup times. With RetroPie, you've got to boot a full Linux distribution, then Emulation Station, then AmiBerry. It's a lot slower upon first startup, but RetroPie brings many convenient features to the table, along with dozens of other emulation platforms, so the choice between options isn't quite so cut and dry. A few more things that bear mention. The 400 has no audio or composite video output like the previous Pi models do. This could pose a problem if your monitor doesn't have speakers or an audio pass-through. As delivered, HDMI is the only option available, although RGB output can be achieved using the GPIO port in custom settings. There are a number of products that facilitate analog video, but having hats or adapters sticking out of the 400 kinda defeats the goal of having an all-in-one machine. Using the built-in HDMI output makes for a compact, clean, and simple user experience, and as much as I love hooking things up to an RGB CRT, I'm not going to do it with this machine. So, my take on the Raspberry Pi 400? Well, at first I was skeptical, because as a Linux desktop, it doesn't really compare to a real PC. But it's easy to forget that inside is a $40 single board computer for projects and education, so we need to temper our expectations accordingly. That said, it makes a terrific emulation platform, and I love the lightweight portability of the thing. You could easily take it anywhere you go you had a monitor to hook up to. The keyboard itself is a pretty standard take on the modern chiclet style, and as such lends it some extra credibility as a successor to the computers of the 70s and 80s. But don't mistake it for those terrible exercises in cost savings. It may be cheap, but it has proper full-size keys, spacing, and action, so typing is natural and works fine for what it is. The lack of external audio or composite video output means that connecting a CRT or external sound system isn't as straightforward as with the regular Pi models. Also, this is still a relatively new platform, and not all software for the Pi 3 is available or working on the 4 yet. For $70 to $100, the Pi 400 is reasonably priced as a standalone emulator and offers a higher degree of functionality than many of the single system reproductions that have been flooding the market as of late. RetroPie can run tens of thousands of software titles owing to the number of emulators it supports, including MAME and DOSBox, just to name a few. Some emulators seem to work flawlessly out of the box, but others have a few video or audio issues. These may just be growing pains associated with the new platform, but be aware this is not a 100% plug-and-play out-of-the-box experience. And as an Amiga emulator, you get an AGA 1200, 4000, or CD32 with a fast 040 processor, tons of memory, and RTG in a small form factor, in addition to the many other supported systems. So there we have it, the Raspberry Pi 400. Is it better than the 4B? Well, it's got a keyboard, and I'll leave the rest for you to decide. I hope you enjoyed this bit, thank you so much for watching, and we'll see you next time on RetroBits.